Welcome back, everyone, to round 5 of the Dubai Rapid Tournament. If you've been keeping up with the series, you'll know I'm 4 out of 4 at this point. And in round 5, I'm playing Grandmaster Iordaschescu from Moldova. His rapid rating is 2632, which puts him among the top players in the world, and he was the top seed in the tournament. Before this game, I had a little time to prepare, and I knew he plays e4 on move 1. And I was debating whether to go into a Stafford Gambit, but I did have a chance to look up his online games, and I saw against the Petrov, he actually avoids the Stafford entirely by playing d4 on move 3. And I didn't want to go into this, especially in a rapid game where he'd probably know more than me. So I decided to stick with my serious tournament repertoire, which is Sicilian defense. And more specifically, I usually like to go for the Taimanov Sicilian, which happens after knight f3, e6, d4, takes, knight c6, knight c3, and queen c7. This has been my kind of main choice for black over the many years of playing in serious tournaments. However, my opponent decided to avoid the open Sicilian and play the move g3 in this position. This is a so-called anti-Sicilian. It has become a bit more trendy recently. I believe Wesley So recommends this in one of his chessable courses. And the idea is very simple, to just fianchetto out of the bishop, castle, and then later sometimes white goes for c3, d4, sometimes plays a more closed position with d3, more kind of King's Indian style attack. And thankfully, I had some idea what to do here. I have studied this line over the years, and I went for kind of my main opening prep is knight c6, bishop g2, knight f6, queen e2. And here I played a somewhat counterintuitive looking move, but it is justified for the position. Here white wants to play e5 and disturb my knight on f6. And the way to prevent that is actually by playing e5 myself. And even though it looks a bit strange to have played e6 on move 2 and then e5 on move 5, it makes sense in this position because it fixes white's pawn on e4, which blocks the bishop, limits the queen. Sometimes in chess, it's okay losing a little bit of time if you're disturbing the opponent from their plans. So here my opponent went ahead, castles, played bishop e7, c3, castling, knight a3. Here comes a moment where I forgot my specific preparation, and I should have known better to play the move rook e8. This is by far the most flexible move. Some x-ray vision against the queen. Also, there's cases where I want to play bishop f8 and defend the pawn on e5 with a rook. And this would have been nice because it keeps the option open of playing d5 if it works out in the position. For example, if white plays knight c2, I can get away with playing d5 here, and after takes, take with queen, defend the pawn, have a nice space advantage, and there's really no concern with discoveries because white doesn't have a great way to move the knight and target my queen. In the game, I ended up playing pawn d6, which of course is still very normal looking, but it just limited my options because I'm committing myself to playing the structure and not giving myself the immediate option of going for d5. However, the game continues from here. Opponent plays knight c2, I play rook e8, d3, and now b5. So we're kind of transitioning from the opening into the middle game. And so far, we've both kind of just stayed within our territory, playing just very solid chess. White has his own very solid, hard to break setup. And with b5, I'm trying to make some progress on the queen side. I did have the plan of someday playing b4 and try and open up some lines and create some weaknesses. My opponent continued to play solidly, played bishop d2, played rook b8, a3, and now a5. And I was feeling pretty good at this point, given that most of the focus has been on the queen side. And generally in these positions, white wants to go for the eventual kingside attack with some like knight e3, move the knight, play f4, knight f5 ideas. And it seems like so far white's a little bit slow to unleash those plans, playing moves like a3 and bishop d2, and just giving me time to expand and gain space. However, white still kind of just remained solid. He went ahead, played knight e3, and here I go for the break, pawn b4, very well supported by both pawns, the knight and the rook. I do want to open some files. However, this perhaps favored white because rather than the b file opening, white took on b4 and played c4, closing down the b file and the c file and keeping the a file open. And now it's white who has control of this file. So this may have been some slight improvement for white. At the same time, kind of a big shift has taken place in the center. White is clamping down on the d5 square, but has given me full control of the d4 square. And this is going to become relevant in just a few more moves. But first, I complete development, bishop e6, h3, queen d7, hitting the pawn, king h2, very standard. And in this position, I made my first slight kind of dubious move of the game. I played my move rather quickly, thinking that I was just playing a natural improving move, that being bishop to f8. In hindsight, this is a mistake, and we're going to see why. What I should have done is just challenge the a file. Should have played rook a8 with idea that I want to bring my queen to b7, take on a1, and bring the other rook to 8, and try and gain control over the file. For example, if white plays knight d5, I can take queen b7 with idea of playing rook a8 and controlling the file. Meanwhile, everything on the king side is relatively under control, and this would have been approximately equal. Now, if we compare this to what happened in the game, when I play bishop f8, this allows white to hop in right away with knight d5. My opponent played this relatively quickly. We do have the timestamps here, so we can see how much time was spent on each move. And I'm pretty sure they're accurate because it was broadcast with the DGT board and a DGT clock. So knight d5 is very powerful here because it threatens to take my knight on f6, and I can't take on d5 with my knight because then I get forked. And I really don't want to take on d5 with the bishop because then white takes back and I can see the bishop pair. However, this was what I ended up doing in the game. I didn't see a great alternative for me. I did check this with the engine afterwards, and Stockfish recommends just moving my bishop back to e7. So essentially losing to tempi, which during the game, I didn't want to admit my mistake of moving the bishop to f8. So I did go ahead, I took, and here the position transforms. White takes on d5. And I go for knight to a7. Now, some of you might be wondering why I didn't play knight d4, but I thought this would have given white very easy play. White would be happy to trade. I'd be left with a very bad bishop on f8, my pawns fixed on dark squares, and white would be expanding on the king side. And I felt like if we got to this position, I would just kind of get smushed. So I was more content with leaving the knight on the board and then remaneuvering it to b5. So here, bishop e3 was played knight b5, and now very nice maneuver from white, knight d2. This is multi-purpose. It does prepare f4, which is white's main way of making progress in the position. On top of that, white's planning to maneuver the knight to c4, pressuring e5, and it's very, very hard to remove the knight once it lands on c4. So here I finally challenge the a file with rook a8, knight c4 is played, queen b7, we trade on a8, and here white plays f4. So at this point, I feel like I'm getting outplayed. Position is beginning to look very unpleasant. This bishop is very passive. White's expanding with a clear plan. Even though I'm now controlling the a file, it's really hard to make progress on the queen side. This knight really just holds everything together, pressures my center. So I played the move knight d7 after about a minute think. And here we can see I'm already approaching the 3-minute mark. My opponent has a decent amount of time. he played his next move quite quickly, queen f2. And queen f2 is actually a really nice move from white because it creates a battery on f-file. f7 is now becoming a more clear target. And it also creates a battery against c5. So there's potential later to take. And then if I take back with pawn, c5 could be a weakness. So here I spent even more time and eventually decided to play pawn takes pawn. Not a move I really wanted to play, but it was hard to find anything much better. I felt a bit stuck. And the benefit of taking with a pawn is that if white takes back with the queen, I can play the move f6 and secure control over the e5 square, have the idea of knight e5, and I was hoping to get a situation like this, where at least I can try and hold my ground and be somewhat solid. But my opponent made the right decision, took back with the pawn. Now, even though this does block the f-file, it very clearly prepares the eventual e5 break. It also opens up the g3 square for the queen. Here, I went ahead and played knight b6. This was one of the ideas with knight d7, is to trade off white's very well-placed knight. And here, my opponent wastes no time with the move pawn e5. Very strong move, yet again, trying to unleash this diagonal. So in the event that I take, white has a soul-crushing move, pawn d6, skewering, and yeah, black's losing a lot of material here. So I can't really take the pawn on e5, and I definitely don't want to take the knight on c4. This will only strengthen white's already immaculate center. So instead, I try to hold my ground with a move rook d8, reinforcing the pawn. And my opponent plays e6, yet another very strong move, just continually gaining space in the center. I don't want to take this pawn and allow d6 with the bishop opening up. My queen would be tied down to the knight. This would be highly, highly unpleasant. So with just 31 seconds left, I had to rely on some intuition, and I played a move which looks really strange at first, but I think it was the best practical decision, is to play pawn f5. Now, the first thing I should note, white can't en passant. That's not legal. It's not how en passant works. If you're confused, Google en passant. And with f5, I just try and close down the position. Even though these pawns are very strong, it's hard for them to make more progress. And both bishops for white are a bit restricted in the position. Light squared bishop being restricted by the center pawns, and this bishop being restricted by my pawns on the dark squares. So yeah, even though the position looks grim and I'm very, very low on time, just surviving on the 5-second increment, I did have a little bit of hope from here. My opponent here played knight to a5, which is a very natural kind of positional improvement. The knight is about to find an even stronger square on c6. Now, I do want to back up because it turns out white had a absolutely amazing tactic here. Instead of knight a5, white had the move bishop takes c5. The point is white sacrifices a whole piece with intention of now making progress with the pawns. And the fact that the queen's attacked, queen is tied down to the knight, e7's coming. This is just going completely downhill for black. Thankfully, my opponent didn't go for this. Went for knight a5, and I am staying alive. I move my queen over, knight c6, rook 8. And here I was expecting my opponent to just win a clean pawn. Turns out there is a pretty simple tactic here for white. Because my c5 pawn is pinned by the queen-bishop battery, white does have the option of taking on b4, but instead my opponent went for queen c2. I went for g6, defending f5. White improves with rook e1. I improve with bishop to g7. And I'm beginning to have more hope. The pieces that I do have, they're finding some harmony, especially with the queen side. Some idea of playing rook a2 and targeting the b pawn. But as we're going to see, it's still a very difficult position to play with very little time. My opponent moves the queen back to f2. And here I really wanted to play rook to a2 and just start targeting the b pawn, get some initiative of my own. Unfortunately, this doesn't quite work due to e7 and the fact that the rook has some x-ray vision to support the pawn. on its journey to becoming a queen, this would not turn out well for me. I would have no time to take because white's just queening. So instead, I played what looks to be a passive move, but I thought the position calls for this move is knight c8, aiming to get the knight to a blockading square on e7. And here's where the video is going to take a slightly different turn. Unbeknownst to me, at this moment in the game, one of my good friends, Irene Sukandar, had finished her game, and she had her GoPro and started recording. And this is where I'm going to do some pseudo live commentary. So I've never done this before. Hopefully I can sync up the moves with the commentary and everything will go smoothly. So let's see how the game unfolds from here. Opponent was taking his time. Of course, he saw my idea of playing knight e7, and I had to be ultra focused here, just trying to anticipate his next move. And he went ahead and played d4, a very nice move for the position, trying to open up lines. I didn't have much time. I took on d4. Now, I was expecting him to take back with one of these pieces, but he actually surprised me. Maybe he didn't want to allow, like, if knight takes, I can take and play knight e7. If bishop takes, I can take and play queen c5. So he dropped back to d2, and I was very quick here to play knight e7. Finally achieving the blockade of the monster e-pawn. And here he takes a pawn on b4. So if we count material, I am down a pawn, trying to figure out what to do. I take on c6, he takes back, and I very quickly play d5, trying to exploit the f4 pawn, which is only defended by the queen. But he's quick to play e7. Now the pawn is just one square away from queening. And I took on c6, which looks like it does everything. It covers e8, it defends d5. The problem with this move is the queen is overworked. Sometimes when a piece is doing too many jobs, it can very easily get punished, as we're going to see. And here my opponent is about to uncork a really nice and simple tactical combination. And I saw it coming, but okay, there's nothing I can do. I can just kind of sit and try and react in the best way possible. Opponent makes a queen. He had his queen in hand already ready. I take. Now he plays bishop d5, deflecting my queen. I take back. He goes up the exchange, play king f7, only move. As we can see, I gained a little bit of time on the clock, but my king is very exposed. The rook is in my face. Here I was expecting rook e7, but it turns out white has another candidate move that he was very wise to take a moment here and consider his options, because sometimes it's not always necessary to deliver the first check that comes to mind. And yeah, he goes ahead, plays queen to e2, threatening mate in one. I have very few options here. Should note my queen is tied down to my knight, so I'd like to defend with my queen, but I choose to defend with a bishop, with bishop to f6. And shortly after I played this move, you can't really see it in my expression, but I realized white has a very simple winning combination. Now he began to take his time, so I was actually a bit hopeful that he wouldn't find the winning combination here. I will say that the first move is to start with rook f8, and then king g7, and then it'll be white to move and win. So he had 1 minute and 13 seconds to start thinking from this position, but he ran his clock down to less than a minute, finally plays rook f8, and then very quickly plays queen e8. Should note rook f6 and queen e7 could have led to mate. And here, I didn't have much time to react. White's going for mating attack. I went ahead and played queen f3, trying to get counterplay. I was dreaming of perpetual check. At this point, we're both very low on time. He's falling below 30 seconds, probably. And it turns out it's white to move and force mate. You can kind of see it in his expression that he spots something. I think he took a little bit of extra time just to double check that everything's working for white, but he goes ahead, plays rook f7, king h6, queen f8, king h5, and rook h7. Took me a moment to notice, but this is check and mate. And yeah, that was round 5. Somewhat dramatic ending. I felt like I got completely outplayed for most of this game, but it does turn out I had a miracle save just before the very end. I want to back up just a few moves. And I know a lot of those moves unfolded very quickly, so I do want to point out Queen e8 turned out to be a serious, serious blunder. What white should have done, as I very quickly mentioned, is take on f6. King takes f6, just gets mated and won to queen e7. I really thought he was going to see it, given how long he spent before playing rook f8. But sometimes in a position like this, when you have a few good-looking options, it's hard to pinpoint which one is the most accurate. And to be fair, queen e8 does look winning, just because my king is about to get mated. It did happen in the game. But it turns out in this position, it's black to move and survive. There's only one move that basically leads to equality. I will admit that I only discovered this with Engine after the game, and the resource for black is somewhat Engine-like, but the move to save everything is knight to c7. Now, what this does is it keeps f7 and g8 covered by the queen, so there's none of this checkmate shenanigans for white. Meanwhile, the queen is attacked by my knight, and the position gets a little bit awkward for white. Just to show one really nice example line, if white keeps the battery on 8th rank with queen c8, there's a really cool move, bishop to e5. And this would have been like superhuman. I think if I played this move, maybe I would get accused of cheating. But the point being, I defend the knight, I attack the pawn, and if pawn takes bishop, queen takes e5 leads to a draw. Because the king is completely naked, my queen will have all the fun delivering perpetual check. So it was a bit unfortunate that I missed knight c7, but overall I was still pleased with my play. Didn't make too many super obvious mistakes this game, and my opponent played really strongly to outplay me and take home the win. So after this game, I stood at 4 out of 5 in the standings. This was a 9-round tournament, so there's still lots of room to fight back and compete for the prizes and the money. So stay tuned for my round 6 recap video. As always, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.